Commander Jake Reaper Morrison stood in the briefing room at Bagram Airfield, his weathered face illuminated by the glow of tactical maps projected on the screen behind him. At 42, he was one of the most experienced SEAL team commanders in Afghanistan, with 17 years of combat operations etched into every scar on his body. His call sign, Reaper, had been earned in Ramadi during the darkest days of the Iraq War, when he'd led his team through 73 consecutive missions without losing a single man. That streak had become legendary, but Morrison knew that in their line of work, legends could die in a single second of bad luck or bad intel. Tonight's mission was critical: extract or eliminate Khalid Ahmadi, a Taliban commander responsible for orchestrating attacks that had killed 23 coalition forces in the past 6 months. Ahmadi was a ghost, a shadow that intelligence analysts had been chasing for 2 years. But 3 days ago, a local informant, a village elder whose son had been killed by Ahmadi's men, had provided the break they needed. Ahmadi was hiding in a compound in the Kunar Valley, near the Pakistan border, surrounded by mountains that had swallowed entire units before. Morrison clicked to the next slide, showing satellite imagery of the target compound. The structure is typical Afghan construction: mud walls, flat roof, single entrance on the south side. Intel suggests Ahmadi has between 5 and 8 fighters with him, but that number could be higher. He paused, letting his team study the images. These weren't rookies. Every man in this room had been hand-picked for SEAL Team 7 because they were the best at what they did. But even the best needed to understand what they were walking into. Overwatch will be provided by Marine Scout snipers, Morrison continued, clicking to the next slide showing the sniper team's position. They'll be positioned on Ridge 7734, approximately 2 kilometers northeast, with clear sight lines into the valley. He brought up photos of the sniper team, 3 Marines who would provide Guardian Angel coverage from above. Among the photos was Staff Sergeant Elena Vargas, and Morrison noticed several of the younger SEALs exchange knowing glances. Petty Officer Jenkins, the team's breacher, let out a low whistle. "That's Ghost, sir. I heard she dropped a guy at almost 2,000 meters last month." Morrison nodded. Vargas was indeed a legend, not just in the Marine Corps, but among all special operations units in theater. At 29, she had 47 confirmed kills, including that infamous shot at 1,847 meters that had saved an entire platoon pinned down by a heavy machine gun position. The Marine Corps didn't make a big deal about it publicly. Female snipers were still a sensitive topic with some of the old guard, but operators knew quality when they saw it. "Staff Sergeant Vargas will be our primary Overwatch," Morrison confirmed. "And gentlemen, I've worked with her before. She's the real deal. If things go sideways, she'll keep us alive." He moved to the terrain model set up on the table, a 3-dimensional representation of the valley built from topographic data. Lieutenant Chris Navarro, Morrison's executive officer and second-in-command, leaned over the model, his brow furrowed with concern. "Sir, this valley is a natural kill funnel," Navarro said, tracing the approach routes with his finger. "High ground on 3 sides, limited exit routes. If they know we're coming, if this is a trap—" Morrison raised his hand, cutting him off. He'd been thinking the same thing since he first saw the mission parameters. The valley was tactically problematic, the kind of place where ambushes happened, but they'd planned for that. "Intel is solid," Morrison said, though he didn't sound entirely convinced himself. "Ahmadi doesn't know we've tracked him. The informant is reliable. He's provided actionable intelligence twice before. We go in fast, clean extraction, wheels up before dawn." He looked around the room at his team. Rodriguez, their medic, who could perform field surgery under fire. Chen, their communications specialist, who could call in air support or jam enemy communications with equal skill. Thompson, their sniper, who served as the team's designated marksman. Jenkins, their breacher, who could blow through any door or wall. And Navarro, his XO, who Morrison trusted with his life. "Insertion time is 2:30 hours, Morrison continued. 2 Black Hawks will take us in low and fast. We hit the ground 300 meters from the compound, Approach on foot using night vision. Thompson takes overwatch position here. He pointed to a small rise overlooking the compound, while the rest of us make entry. We're looking for Ahmadi specifically, but we secure any intelligence we can find. Hard drives, documents, phones, anything that might lead us to other Taliban commanders in the network. The briefing continued for another 30 minutes, covering contingencies, extraction protocols, rules of engagement, and communication frequencies. Morrison had learned long ago that survival in combat came down to preparation and adaptability. You planned for everything you could imagine, then stayed flexible enough to handle what you couldn't. As the team filed out to gear up, Morrison felt that familiar sensation gnawing at his gut, that sixth sense that had kept him alive through countless operations. Something felt off about this mission, though he couldn't articulate exactly what. 2,000 meters away, on a windswept ridge that overlooked the Kunar Valley, Staff Sergeant Alina Vargas was feeling the same unease. She'd arrived at the observation post 6 hours earlier, well before sunset, and had spent the time studying the valley through her spotting scope. The daughter of a Colorado rancher, she'd been shooting since age 6, following her older brother Marcus through the mountains with a .22 rifle, learning to read wind patterns, calculate distance by eye, and anticipate the movement of game animals before they moved. Marcus had joined the Marines and died in Fallujah when Alina was 17, killed by a sniper while trying to help a wounded Marine reach cover. She'd enlisted on her 18th birthday, driven by grief and a fierce desire to honor her brother's sacrifice. The recruiter had suggested administration or logistics, but Alina had insisted on the infantry, or as close as a woman could get at the time. She'd pushed, trained, outshot male recruits consistently, and eventually earned a spot in Scout Sniper School when the Marines finally opened it to women. Now, 8 years later, she was the best shot in the Marine Corps, and everyone who mattered knew it. Her spotter, Corporal Davis, settled in beside her as darkness fell over the valley. "SEALs are infilling in 30 minutes, he whispered, checking his own equipment. Vargas nodded without taking her eye from the scope. She'd been studying the compound all afternoon, watching the patterns of movement, counting the guards, noting the positions of heavy weapons. Something bothered her about what she was seeing, or rather, what she wasn't seeing. "There's not enough activity down there," she said quietly. "Intel says Ahmadi has 5 to 8 fighters. I've counted 3, and they're not acting like they're protecting a high-value target. They're too relaxed, too casual." Davis looked through his own scope, studying the compound. "Maybe they don't know we're coming. Maybe Ahmadi's keeping his head down." Vargas wanted to believe that, but her instincts were screaming otherwise. She'd learned to trust those instincts in the mountains of Colorado and refine them through countless combat operations. Right now, those instincts were telling her that something was very wrong in the valley below. She keyed her radio, connecting to the command frequency. "Overwatch to TOC, I have concerns about the target compound. Activity level is inconsistent with intelligence estimates." The reply came back after a moment. "Copy, Overwatch. Intelligence stands. Mission is go." Vargas bit back her frustration. Intelligence was rarely perfect, and commanders had to make decisions based on imperfect information. But she couldn't shake the feeling that Team 7 was walking into something bad. She checked her rifle one more time, her beloved M40A5, a weapon she'd customized over years of use until it was an extension of her own body. 30 rounds in her immediate pouches, another 90 in her pack. Her M4 carbine lay beside her with 6 magazines. Her Sig Sauer M18 pistol was holstered on her thigh. "If this goes bad," she said to Davis, "we're going to be the only thing standing between those SEALs and a very bad night." Davis nodded grimly. They both knew that Overwatch snipers were often the difference between a successful mission and a catastrophe. Vargas settled behind her rifle, adjusted her position slightly to account for the wind that was picking up from the east, and waited. In the distance, she could hear the faint sound of helicopter rotors beginning to beat the air. Team 7 was coming, and whatever waited in that valley, Elena Vargas would be ready. The MH-60 Black Hawk helicopters swept low over the mountains, rotors chopping the thin Afghan air with a rhythmic thunder that reverberated through the valleys below. Commander Jake Morrison sat in the door of the lead helicopter, his legs dangling over the edge, scanning the darkness below through his night vision goggles. The world was rendered in shades of green and black, the mountains rising like jagged teeth against the star-filled sky. Morrison had made hundreds of insertions like this, but the fear never completely went away. That was good. Fear kept you sharp, kept you alive. The team sat in silence, each man running through the mission in his mind, checking and rechecking equipment out of habit and superstition. Jenkins was running his fingers over the det cord in his breaching kit. Rodriguez had his medical bag between his knees, mentally inventorying its contents for the 100th time. Chen was monitoring the radio frequencies, listening for any indication that the Taliban knew they were coming. Thompson cradled his SR-25 rifle, the team's designated marksman weapon, his face expressionless behind his night vision. Lieutenant Navarro sat across from Morrison, and their eyes met in the darkness. No words were needed. They'd worked together for 3 years, had survived Helmand Province, Kandahar, and a dozen other hellholes. Navarro gave a slight nod, and Morrison returned it. The XO was solid, the kind of officer Morrison would follow into hell if necessary. Tonight might be exactly that. The pilot's voice crackled through Morrison's headset. 2 minutes to insertion point. LZ appears cold, no visible hostiles, no electronic emissions detected. Morrison keyed his radio. Copy. Team 7, final weapons check. The SEALs went through their ritual. Charging handles were pulled back and released. Safeties were checked. Night vision devices were adjusted. Morrison's custom M4 with its SOP MOD kit felt comfortable in his hands, worn smooth from years of use, perfectly balanced. Every modification made for a specific purpose learned through hard experience. The helicopters began their descent, flaring hard as they approached the dried riverbed that served as their landing zone. The insertion point was 300 meters from the compound, far enough to avoid alerting the enemy but close enough for a quick approach. Morrison could see the compound now through his night vision, dark and seemingly quiet, just as the intelligence had predicted. But something felt wrong. The hair on the back of his neck was standing up, that primitive warning system that had saved his life more than once. 30 seconds, the pilot announced. Morrison grabbed the fast rope, preparing to slide down. The helicopter was 10 feet off the ground now, dust and debris swirling in the rotor wash. Go, go, go! Morrison descended the rope, hit the ground in a crouch, and immediately moved away from the helicopter to establish a perimeter. Behind him, his team flowed out of the aircraft with practiced efficiency. 8 shadows in the darkness, weapons up, scanning their sectors. The second helicopter came in right behind them, inserting the reserve element, another 4-man team that would secure the landing zone and provide rear security. Within 45 seconds, both helicopters had lifted off and were disappearing into the night, their rotor noise fading to a distant whisper. Team 7 was alone in enemy territory, 300 meters from a compound that might hold one of the most wanted Taliban commanders in Afghanistan. Morrison took a knee in the dried riverbed, his rifle covering the approach to the compound while his team formed up behind him. The night was quiet, too quiet. No dogs barking, no generators running, no voices. In his experience, Afghan compounds were rarely this silent. There should be some sign of life, even at 2:30 hours. He pushed the thought aside. Maybe they were asleep. Maybe their operational security was just that good. "Let's move," Morrison whispered into his radio. The team began their approach in a staggered column formation, moving slowly and deliberately through the rocky terrain. Jenkins took point, his eyes scanning for trip wires or pressure plates that might indicate IEDs. Morrison moved in the middle of the formation, where he could control the team and respond to threats from any direction. Navarro brought up the rear, constantly checking behind them to ensure they weren't being followed. They covered 200 meters without incident. The compound loomed ahead, its mud walls pale in the starlight. Morrison could see the single entrance on the south side, just as the satellite imagery had shown. No guards visible, no movement. His unease grew with every step. Where were the sentries? Even the most complacent Taliban commander posted guards at night. This felt wrong on a fundamental level. They were 50 meters from the compound when Petty Officer Jenkins suddenly raised his fist, the signal to freeze. The entire team went motionless, dropping into whatever cover was available. Morrison's finger moved to his trigger as he scanned for threats. What had Jenkins seen? For 5 seconds, nothing happened. 10 seconds. 15. Then Morrison saw it. A thin wire stretched across the path at ankle height, almost invisible even with night vision. Jenkins had spotted it just in time. But it was already too late. The valley erupted in a thunderclap of explosions that shattered the night. IEDs detonated in sequence, massive blasts that threw dirt and rocks 50 feet into the air. Morrison felt the shockwave slam into him like a physical punch, driving the air from his lungs. His night vision whited out from the explosions, leaving him temporarily blind. His ears rang with a high-pitched whine that drowned out all other sound. For a moment, he couldn't tell if he was standing or lying down, couldn't tell which way was up. Then the machine guns opened up. Muzzle flashes erupted from positions they hadn't seen, spider holes cleverly concealed in the terrain, bunkers dug into the hillsides, fighting positions in the compound walls. Tracers cut through the darkness like lethal fireflies, creating a crossfire that enveloped Team 7. This wasn't a Taliban hideout. It was a fortress, and they'd walked straight into a carefully orchestrated trap. "Ambush! Break contact!" Morrison yelled into his radio, though he couldn't even hear his own voice over the ringing in his ears. His night vision was slowly recovering, showing him a nightmare landscape of fire and smoke. He could see his team members diving for cover, returning fire, trying to fight their way out of the kill zone. A PKM machine gun opened up from the compound roof, its heavy rounds chewing up the ground around them. Morrison was moving toward better cover when another IED exploded directly to his left. The blast picked him up like a rag doll and threw him sideways. Time seemed to slow down. He felt something punch through his shoulder, a bullet, hot and sharp. Then his leg exploded in white-hot agony as another round tore through his thigh, shattering bone. He was airborne, tumbling, falling through space that shouldn't be there. He hit the ground hard and kept rolling, bouncing off rocks, crashing through brush, unable to stop his momentum. He was falling down a steep ravine he hadn't seen in the chaos, a natural crevasse hidden by darkness and smoke. He slammed into a boulder with enough force to crack ribs, and finally came to rest in a jumbled heap at the bottom of a 20-foot drop. Morrison lay there, stunned, trying to breathe, trying to understand what had just happened. Every part of his body screamed with pain. He tried to move his right arm and couldn't. Looking down, he saw blood soaking through his uniform at the shoulder. His left leg was bent at an unnatural angle, and when he tried to move it, the pain was so intense that black spots danced in his vision. He was badly wounded, separated from his team, and alone in the darkness. Above him, he could still hear the firefight continuing, the sharp crack of M4 rifles, the deeper boom of AK-47s, the sustained roar of machine guns, the occasional explosion of grenades. His team was fighting for their lives, and he couldn't help them. Morrison fumbled for his radio with his left hand, the only limb that seemed to be working properly. His fingers found the device clipped to his vest, but when he tried to key it, nothing happened. The radio was crushed, sparking uselessly, destroyed in the fall. He was alone, wounded and cut off from his team, lying in a ravine in the middle of enemy territory. Morrison forced himself to think past the pain, to assess his situation with the cold logic that had kept him alive through 17 years of combat. The shoulder wound was serious but not immediately life-threatening. The bullet had gone through clean, missing major arteries. But his leg was bad, very bad. He could see bone fragments visible through his torn uniform, could feel blood soaking into his pants. With his good hand, Morrison pulled a tourniquet from his kit and applied it to his thigh, cinching it tight despite the agony. Then he used another tourniquet on his shoulder, wrapping it awkwardly with one hand. The pain was incredible, but he bit down on his glove to keep from screaming. Screaming would give away his position. Above him, he could hear voices now, Taliban fighters shouting to each other in Pashto, celebrating their ambush. How many of his men were dead? How many were wounded? Morrison dragged himself behind a cluster of large boulders, leaving a blood trail he couldn't avoid. He found a small cave-like space between the rocks and wedged himself in, pulling loose brush over the entrance. His M4 was gone, lost somewhere in the fall, but his sidearm was still holstered on his thigh. He drew it with trembling hands, a Sig Sauer P226 with 2 spare magazines, 45 rounds total. If the Taliban found him, it wouldn't be enough, but he'd take as many with him as he could. 2,000 meters away, on Ridge 7734, Elena Vargas watched the ambush unfold through her scope with mounting horror. She'd seen the first IED detonate, had watched Team 7 disappear in clouds of smoke and dust. Through her thermal scope, she could see the heat signatures of Taliban fighters, dozens of them, far more than intelligence had predicted. This wasn't 5 to 8 fighters. This was a company-sized element, at least 40 combatants, and they'd been waiting. "I've got multiple casualties," she reported to the Tactical Operations Center, her voice calm despite the chaos below. "SEAL commander is down, fell into the northern ravine. Team 7 is pinned and taking heavy casualties." She could see Morrison's heat signature tumbling down the ravine, could see him come to rest at the bottom. Was he alive? Dead? She couldn't tell from this distance. Vargas began engaging targets immediately, her rifle barking as she dropped Taliban fighters who were maneuvering to flank the SEALs. One shot, one kill. Work the bolt, acquire next target fire. She fell into the rhythm she'd practiced 10,000 times, her body moving on autopilot while her mind calculated wind, distance, angle. An enemy fighter with an RPG appeared on a rooftop. She dropped him at 1,150 meters. Another fighter trying to set up a machine gun, dead at 980 meters. A group of 3 moving to surround the SEALs. 3 shots, 3 kills, ranging from 890 to 1,100 meters. "Team 7, this is Overwatch," Vargas transmitted. "You need to pull back now. I count at least 40 enemy fighters converging on your position. You're about to be overrun." Lieutenant Navarro's voice came back, strained and desperate, with gunfire crackling in the background. "We can't leave the commander. Where is he? Do you have eyes on?" Vargas swept her scope back to the ravine, searching the shadows and smoke with her thermal imaging. There, movement behind a cluster of rocks at the bottom. A heat signature, smaller now, partially concealed but definitely human. It was Morrison, and he was moving, which meant he was alive. She watched him drag himself into cover between the rocks, watched him pull brush over his position. Even wounded and alone, the SEAL commander's training was taking over. "I see him," Vargas reported, her heart sinking. "He's mobile but severely wounded. Northern ravine, approximately 70 meters from your position." But even as she said the words, she could see Taliban fighters moving toward the ravine. They'd seen Morrison fall too, and they were hunting him. She began engaging them, dropping fighter after fighter, but there were too many. For every one she killed, 2 more appeared. Lieutenant Navarro's voice cracked with emotion. "We're going after him. Cover us." Vargas watched through her scope as 3 SEALs broke from cover, running toward the ravine under heavy fire. She provided covering fire, her rifle growing hot from rapid shooting, but the Taliban had the SEALs in a crossfire. She watched helplessly as one SEAL went down, then another. The third made it 10 meters before being forced back by machine gun fire. "Negative, negative," Navarro shouted. "We can't reach him. We have to extract." The decision was tearing him apart. Vargas could hear it in his voice. But it was the right decision. If they stayed, the entire team would be wiped out. The remaining members of Team 7 fought their way back to the landing zone, with Vargas dropping another 6 Taliban fighters to cover their withdrawal. Her shooting was beyond precise now. It was supernatural. each shot finding its mark despite impossible distances and moving targets. The rescue helicopters swooped in, their door gunners laying down suppressive fire. The SEALs scrambled aboard, some carrying wounded teammates. Vargas kept shooting, giving them every second she could. Then the helicopters lifted off, banking hard to avoid RPG fire, and disappeared into the night. The valley fell quiet except for the shouts of Taliban fighters celebrating their victory. Vargas kept her scope trained on that cluster of rocks where Morrison had taken shelter. She could still see his heat signature, faint but present. He was alive, alone, and surrounded by enemies. "I'm sorry," she whispered, though no one could hear her. "I'm so sorry." But even as she said it, her mind was already working, calculating, planning. Morrison had saved her life once on a mission 6 months ago when her position had been compromised. He'd led his team in to extract her and her spotter, fighting through an ambush to get them out. Marines paid their debts, and Elena Vargas never forgot who had her back. The flight back to Forward Operating Base Chapman was the longest of Lieutenant Chris Navarro's life. The Black Hawk's interior was slick with blood, the acrid smell of gunpowder and sweat filling the confined space. 4 of his teammates were wounded. Jenkins had taken shrapnel to his left arm and shoulder. Rodriguez had been hit in the side by a ricochet that cracked 2 ribs. Chen had a deep gash across his forehead from an explosion, and Thompson had been shot through the calf muscle. The combat medic worked frantically, moving from man to man, stopping bleeding, starting IVs, calling out vital signs over the rotor noise. But the worst wound was one Navarro couldn't see, the psychological trauma of leaving their commander behind. Every man on that helicopter had served under Morrison for years. He'd led them through hell more times than they could count, had made decisions that saved their lives, had stood between them and death on countless occasions. And they'd left him to die in a ravine in Afghanistan. Navarro knew it was the right tactical decision. Staying would have meant losing the entire team. But knowing something intellectually didn't make it hurt any less. When they landed at FOB Chapman, the base was a flurry of activity. Medical personnel rushed to the helicopter, pulling the wounded out on stretchers. Navarro refused help despite the shrapnel wounds in his side and the blood running down his face from a cut above his eye. He had more important things to do. He went straight to the command center, limping slightly, leaving a trail of blood drops behind him on the concrete. Colonel Briggs was waiting in the Tactical Operations Center, his face grim in the blue glow of computer screens. The colonel was a career officer, 53 years old, with more deployments than most soldiers could count. He'd been a ranger before joining JSOC, had seen his share of operations go wrong, but Navarro could see the weight of this failure in his eyes. Behind him, intelligence analysts were reviewing drone footage of the ambush, and Navarro could see the red heat signatures of bodies scattered across the valley floor, Taliban and American alike. "We're launching a recovery operation," Navarro said before Briggs could speak, his voice hoarse from shouting commands during the firefight. "Right now. We get air support, we go back in force, and we bring Commander Morrison home." The words came out with more force than he'd intended, but he was beyond caring about military protocol. His commander was dying in that valley, and every minute they delayed decreased his chances of survival. Colonel Briggs shook his head slowly, and Navarro felt his heart sink. "Negative, Lieutenant. The area is too hot. We sent a Reaper drone over the valley 30 minutes ago. There are Taliban everywhere, at least 60 fighters now, maybe more. They're searching for Morrison, and they've set up defensive positions expecting us to come back. Without confirmation that Commander Morrison is alive, I cannot authorize risking more lives on a recovery mission." "He's alive, sir," Navarro insisted, stepping closer to the map display. "I know Jake Morrison. He's the toughest son of a bitch I've ever met. He survived the fall, he found cover, and he's waiting for us to come get him." But even as he said it, Navarro knew how it sounded, like desperation, like denial, like a man grasping at hope because he couldn't face the alternative. Briggs put a hand on Navarro's shoulder, his voice softening. "Chris, I understand what you're feeling, I do, But I have to think about the bigger picture. We've already lost good men tonight. I can't send more operators into a trap without actionable intelligence. If we get confirmation Morrison is alive, if we can develop a workable plan, then we'll talk. But right now, the answer is no." He paused, and Navarro could see the pain in the colonel's eyes. "I need you to prepare to notify his family. His wife Sarah and daughter Emma are at Camp Pendleton. They need to hear it from someone who knew him." Navarro felt like he'd been punched in the gut. Notify the family. That meant Morrison was being declared KIA, killed in action. That meant they were giving up on him. "Sir, with all due respect," he began, but Briggs cut him off with a raised hand. "That's an order, Lieutenant. Get yourself patched up, debrief your team, and prepare the casualty report. I'm sorry, I truly am." The colonel turned back to the tactical display, and Navarro knew the conversation was over. He walked out into the Afghan night, his mind reeling. The base was quieter now, the initial crisis response winding down. Soldiers moved between buildings with purpose, helicopters sat silent on their pads, and somewhere in the distance, a generator hummed steadily. Navarro found himself sitting on a concrete barrier near the motor pool, staring at nothing, trying to process what had just happened. How could he call Sarah Morrison and tell her that her husband was dead, or worse, captured by the Taliban? How could he face 8-year-old Emma and tell her that Daddy wasn't coming home? Morrison had saved Navarro's life 4 times in 3 years. Once in Helmand Province, when an IED had flipped their vehicle, and Morrison had pulled him from the burning wreckage while under fire. Once in Kandahar when they'd been ambushed, and Morrison had exposed himself to draw enemy fire away from Navarro's position. Once during a rooftop extraction when Navarro had been hit, and Morrison had carried him 200 meters to the helicopter. And once during a close-quarters battle in a compound when a Taliban fighter had gotten behind Navarro, and Morrison had shot him literally 1 second before he pulled the trigger. 4 times Morrison had stood between Navarro and death, and when Morrison needed him most, Navarro had left him behind. He put his head in his hands, and for the first time in his career as a SEAL, Lieutenant Chris Navarro felt like he wanted to quit. Not just this mission, not just this deployment, everything. How could he continue serving when he'd abandoned his commander? "He's alive." The voice came from behind him, quiet but certain. Navarro turned to see Staff Sergeant Elena Vargas standing there, still in her combat gear, her rifle slung over her shoulder, her face streaked with dust and camouflage paint. Her eyes were red-rimmed from dust or emotion. Navarro couldn't tell, but they were focused and determined. "Staff Sergeant," Navarro said, standing quickly despite his wounds. Military protocol demanded respect, even in the middle of a crisis. "I saw him fall. I saw," Vargas cut him off, stepping closer. "I saw him too, Lieutenant. I had eyes on him through my thermal scope the entire time. I watched him fall into that ravine, watched him apply tourniquets to his wounds, watched him drag himself behind those rocks and take cover. He was alive 30 minutes ago when we extracted, and unless he's bled out since then, he's alive right now." Navarro studied her face, searching for any sign of false hope or wishful thinking, but Vargas was known for being brutally honest, almost cold in her assessments. If she said Morrison was alive, she believed it. "Command won't authorize a rescue mission," he said quietly, defeat evident in his voice. "Colonel Briggs says the area is too hot, too many enemy fighters. Without confirmation of life, he won't risk more operators." Vargas nodded slowly, as if she'd expected this response. "I know. That's why I'm not asking for authorization." She pulled out a tactical map and spread it on the concrete barrier, using small rocks to hold down the corners. The map showed the Kunar Valley in detail, every ridge, every draw, every piece of terrain within 10 kilometers of the ambush site. Vargas had marked it extensively with notes and observations, the product of 4 months of Overwatch missions in this area. "I've done Overwatch on that valley for 4 months, Lieutenant. Every single day, watching through my scope, memorizing terrain features, tracking enemy movements, learning patterns. I know every trail, every cave, every piece of cover. I know where the Taliban patrol routes are, where they cache supplies, where their blind spots are. I can get to Commander Morrison." Her finger traced a route on the map, showing a path that wound through the mountains, avoiding known enemy positions. "It's 15 kilometers through enemy territory," Navarro said, though his voice had lost some of its despair. A small spark of hope was kindling in his chest. "Alone. No support, no backup, no extraction plan if things go wrong. Staff Sergeant, what you're describing is a suicide mission." He wasn't trying to dissuade her. He was making sure she understood exactly what she was proposing. Vargas met his eyes, and Navarro saw something there that reminded him of Morrison himself, an absolute unwillingness to leave anyone behind, regardless of the cost. "I'm a Marine Scout sniper, Lieutenant. We train for exactly this kind of mission. Deep reconnaissance, evasion, survival behind enemy lines. I can move through terrain that would stop an infantry squad. I can navigate at night without electronic devices. And I'm the only person on this base who knows exactly where Commander Morrison is. Not approximately, not probably, exactly." She pointed to a spot on the map. "He's here, in a cluster of 3 large boulders at the base of the northern ravine. I watched him crawl into a small cave-like opening between the rocks. I saw him pull brush over the entrance to conceal himself. That's not a guess or an estimate. That's where he is." The certainty in her voice was absolute, and Navarro found himself believing her. "Why?" he asked quietly. "Why are you willing to risk your life for a SEAL commander you barely know? You've done your job. You provided overwatch. You got us out alive. You killed." He glanced at the after-action report on his tactical pad. 17 enemy fighters during the engagement. "You've done more than anyone could ask. You don't owe Morrison anything." Vargas was quiet for a long moment, staring at the map. When she spoke, her voice was soft but carried the weight of old pain. 6 months ago, my spotter and I were compromised during a mission near Jalalabad. Taliban fighters surrounded our position. We were pinned down, out of ammunition, about to be overrun. Commander Morrison heard our distress call and led his team in to extract us. He didn't know us, didn't owe us anything, but he came anyway. Fought through an ambush to get us out. My spotter took a bullet that would have killed him, and Morrison personally provided medical care during the extraction. She looked up at Navarro. "But more than that, I know what it's like to lose someone. My brother Marcus was a Marine. He died in Fallujah trying to save his squad. He didn't make it out and his team had to leave him behind. It destroyed my family. Commander Morrison has a wife and a daughter waiting for him at Camp Pendleton. I won't let them go through what my family went through, not if there's any chance I can prevent it." Navarro felt a lump forming in his throat. He understood now, this wasn't just about tactics or duty. This was personal for Vargas, driven by a debt she felt she owed and a tragedy she was determined not to see repeated. He looked at the map again, studying her proposed route. It was risky as hell, but it might actually work. If anyone could pull off a solo infiltration through enemy territory, it was Elena Vargas. "If you're not back in 36 hours, Navarro said slowly, making his decision, "I have to report both of you as KIA. That's all the time I can give you before Colonel Briggs demands answers. 36 hours, Staff Sergeant. After that, I'll have to tell Morrison's family he's dead, and yours that you died trying to save him." Vargas nodded, rolling up her map. 36 hours is plenty of time, sir. I'll have him back here in less than 24. She spoke with such confidence that Navarro almost believed her. Almost. "I need to requisition some supplies from medical, blood products, antibiotics, advanced trauma supplies. Morrison's wounds are serious. Even if I get to him, keeping him alive long enough for extraction is going to be the hard part." "Take whatever you need," Navarro said. "I'll make sure medical doesn't ask questions." He paused, then extended his hand. "Semper Fi, Staff Sergeant. Bring our commander home." Vargas shook his hand firmly. "Semper Fi, Lieutenant. Tell Colonel Briggs I went on a personal reconnaissance mission and will be back tomorrow. That gives you plausible deniability if this goes wrong." Navarro watched her walk toward the supply depot, her stride purposeful despite the fact she was about to embark on what might be the most dangerous mission of her life. He should stop her. He should report this to Colonel Briggs immediately. But he didn't. Because sometimes, the right thing to do wasn't the thing the regulations allowed. Sometimes, you had to trust that there were still people in the world who believed in honor, duty, and leaving no one behind, even when it meant walking alone into hell. Vargas spent the next hour gathering her gear with methodical precision. Her M40A5 sniper rifle cleaned and ready, her M4 carbine as backup, her Sig Sauer M18 sidearm with 3 spare magazines, 600 rounds total across all weapons, hopefully more than she'd need. A combat medical kit expanded with extra supplies, tourniquets, hemostatic gauze, antibiotics, morphine, IV fluids, and 3 units of O-negative blood that she signed for personally. 3 liters of water, high-calorie energy bars, her night vision goggles and thermal scope, a survival radio for emergency extraction, paracord, a knife, fire starter, and a small survival kit. Total weight, 43 pounds on top of her body armor and equipment. It was heavy, but she'd trained with heavier loads in the mountains of Colorado and during Scout Sniper School. She could carry it 15 kilometers if necessary, and she would. She checked her watch, 4:45 hours. She'd move out at 500, using the last hour of darkness to get clear of the base and into the mountains before sunrise. At 4:58 hours, Staff Sergeant Elena Vargas slipped through a gap in the perimeter wire that she'd scouted weeks ago. The sentries didn't see her. She moved like a ghost, using shadows and dead zones in the security cameras. Within minutes, she was beyond the protective wire and lights of the base, swallowed by the darkness of the Afghan mountains. Behind her, FOB Chapman continued its normal operations, most personnel unaware that one Marine had just launched an unauthorized solo rescue mission into enemy territory. In the valley 15 kilometers away, Commander Jake Morrison drifted in and out of consciousness behind his boulder, fighting pain and shock and the creeping cold that meant his body was losing the battle. He didn't know that help was coming. He didn't know that a Marine sniper he'd saved 6 months ago was walking through the darkness to return the favor. All he knew was that he had to stay alive, had to keep fighting, because somewhere in California, his wife and daughter were waiting for him to come home. And Jake Morrison had never broken a promise to his family. Not yet, not ever. Elena Vargas moved through the Afghan mountains like a predator born to this terrain. The pre-dawn darkness was absolute, the kind of black that swallowed light and sound, but she navigated with confidence born from 4 months of studying every ridge, every valley, every rock formation through her scope. She'd learned land navigation from her father during elk hunting trips in the Colorado Rockies, how to read terrain in the dark, how to move silently over loose rock, how to become invisible in open country. Those childhood lessons, combined with Marine Scout sniper training and countless combat operations, had transformed her into something more than a soldier. She was a ghost. The first 5 kilometers took her 90 minutes of careful movement. She stayed off the obvious trails, knowing the Taliban often booby-trapped them or watched them from concealed positions. Instead, she followed the ridgelines where the rock was solid and wouldn't leave tracks, where she could see potential threats before they saw her. Every 100 meters, she stopped completely, becoming as still as the stones around her, listening and watching. Patience was the key to survival in this kind of mission. Rush, and you died. Take your time, and you might just live. At 6:30 hours, with dawn beginning to paint the eastern sky in shades of gray, Vargas spotted her first Taliban patrol. 4 fighters, moving along a trail about 300 meters below her position. They were talking loudly, laughing, their weapons slung casually over their shoulders. Undisciplined, Vargas thought. They weren't expecting anyone to be out here. She froze in place, her desert camouflage and ghillie suit breaking up her outline against the rocks. Even if one of the fighters looked directly at her position, his eyes would slide past without registering the human shape. The patrol passed within 20 meters of her position, so close she could smell their cigarette smoke and hear their conversation in Pashto. One of them was complaining about the cold, another was talking about his family in Pakistan. They were young, maybe early 20s, and Vargas felt a strange mix of emotions watching them. These were enemy fighters, men who would kill her without hesitation if they discovered her. But they were also someone's sons, someone's brothers. War was complicated that way. After they passed, Vargas remained motionless for another 10 minutes, making sure they hadn't left anyone behind to watch their backtrail, a common Taliban tactic. Only when she was certain did she continue moving. The sun was rising now, which meant she needed to find a hide position soon. Moving during daylight was exponentially more dangerous, but she'd planned for this. 2 kilometers ahead was a cluster of rocks she'd identified during her Overwatch missions, a natural formation that would provide concealment and a view of the surrounding terrain. She reached the hide position at 7:15 hours, just as the sun cleared the mountains and flooded the valley with harsh morning light. The rocks formed a small cave-like shelter, barely large enough for one person but perfectly positioned. Vargas crawled inside, arranged loose stones to conceal the entrance, and settled in to wait out the daylight hours. From this position, she could see 3 kilometers in every direction, could watch enemy movement patterns without being seen herself. Through her spotting scope, she could see the valley where Morrison had fallen. Taliban fighters were everywhere. She counted at least 25 in visual range, with certainly more beyond the ridgelines. They were conducting a systematic search, moving in teams of 3 or 4, checking every cave, every cluster of rocks, every potential hiding place. They knew a high-value target was down there, and they were determined to find him. The question that kept Vargas awake despite her exhaustion: had they already found Morrison? She pulled out a protein bar and forced herself to eat, though she had no appetite. Her body needed fuel for what was coming. She drank water sparingly. She had 3 liters, but in this heat, that wouldn't last long. As the day heated up, the temperature inside her rocky hide climbed to over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Sweat soaked through her uniform, and she had to fight the urge to drink more water. Discipline. That's what separated survivors from casualties in this environment. At 14:30 hours, Vargas saw something that made her heart race. A Taliban patrol was working its way along the northern ravine, the exact ravine where Morrison was hiding. She put her eye to her scope and watched them search, moving slowly, checking every potential hiding spot. They were getting closer to Morrison's position. 600 meters, 500, 400. She ranged the lead fighter, 647 meters, a shot she could make in her sleep. But if she fired, every Taliban fighter in the valley would know she was here. Through her scope, she could see the cluster of 3 boulders where Morrison was concealed. No movement, no sign of life. Was he still alive? Had he already died from his wounds? The Taliban fighters were 300 meters away now, working methodically toward his position. Vargas's finger rested on her trigger. 200 meters. Her heart was pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. 150 meters. Then, like a miracle, the lead fighter's radio crackled to life. Vargas could hear it through her directional microphone. Urgent voices, someone calling them back to the compound for a leadership meeting. The fighters looked frustrated but turned around, moving away from Morrison's position. Vargas let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Morrison had just gotten incredibly lucky, but luck only lasted so long. As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and red, Vargas prepared to move. She'd studied Morrison's position all day through her scope, planning her approach down to the meter. She could see the heat signatures of Taliban fighters starting to settle in for the evening, some building fires, others gathering in groups. Most would eat dinner and then bed down for the night, leaving only sentries awake. That's when she'd make her move. At 19:45 hours, as darkness settled over the mountains, Vargas emerged from her hide. She'd been motionless for 12 hours and her muscles screamed in protest, but she pushed through it. She had 8 kilometers left to cover, and most of it was through the heart of enemy-controlled territory. She moved down from the ridgeline into the valley, using every bit of cover, every shadow, every depression in the ground. The descent was treacherous. The slope was steep and covered in loose scree that could give away her position with one careless step. She moved at a glacial pace, testing each foothold before committing her weight, controlling her breathing to stay silent. It took her 45 agonizing minutes to cover just 300 meters down the slope. Above her, she could see the glow of Taliban campfires dotting the hillsides. Below her, the valley floor was dark except for occasional flashlight beams as sentries made their rounds. At 21:30 hours, Vargas reached the valley floor and faced her most dangerous challenge yet, crossing open ground to reach Morrison's position. The cluster of boulders was 500 meters away, across terrain with minimal cover. Taliban fighters were camped on 3 sides, with sentries patrolling irregularly. She'd have to time her movement perfectly, slipping between their patrol routes during the gaps in their coverage. She waited and watched, counting the interval between patrols. 7 minutes. That's how long she had to cover 500 meters of open ground without being seen or heard. It should have been impossible, but Vargas had learned something during her years as a scout sniper. Nothing was impossible if you were willing to move slowly enough. She began her crossing, moving in short bursts timed to the sentry's movements, freezing completely when anyone looked in her direction. Halfway across, at the 250-meter mark, disaster nearly struck. A Taliban fighter emerged from a spider hole she hadn't known was there, appearing just 15 meters to her left. Vargas dropped flat, her face pressed into the dirt, not daring to breathe. The fighter lit a cigarette, and in the brief flare of the match she could see his face clearly. He was young, no more than 19, with a wispy beard and tired eyes. He stood there smoking for what felt like an eternity, looking out over the valley, completely unaware that an American Marine sniper was lying motionless 15 meters away. Finally, he dropped the cigarette, ground it out with his boot, and disappeared back into his spider hole. Vargas waited 5 full minutes before moving again, her heart hammering against her ribs. That had been too close, but she was committed now. There was no going back. She continued her crossing, and at 22:47 hours, she finally reached the cluster of boulders where Morrison was hidden. "Commander Morrison," she whispered into the darkness between the rocks. No response. Fear gripped her heart. Was she too late? Had Morrison died while she was crossing the valley? She crawled closer, rifle ready in case it was a trap, in case the Taliban had already found him and were using his position to ambush anyone who came looking. "Commander Morrison, it's Staff Sergeant Vargas, Marine Scout Snipers. I'm here to bring you home, sir." Still nothing. Vargas pulled out a small red lens flashlight. Red light preserved night vision better than white, and risked a brief flash into the cave-like opening between the boulders. In that split second of illumination, she saw him. Morrison was wedged deep between the rocks, his uniform soaked with blood, his face pale as death. His eyes were closed, his breathing shallow and irregular. For a terrible moment, she thought she was looking at a corpse. Then his eyes flickered open, unfocused and confused, struggling to make sense of what he was seeing. "Who?" he croaked, his voice barely audible. His lips were cracked and bleeding from dehydration, his skin hot to the touch with fever. Vargas could see he was in bad shape, worse than she'd feared. The tourniquets he'd applied had saved his life, but the wounds were clearly infected and he'd lost a dangerous amount of blood. "Staff Sergeant Elena Vargas, Marine Scout Snipers," she said quietly, moving closer to assess his condition. "I'm here to bring you home, sir, but I need you to stay quiet and stay still while I work." She pulled out her medical kit and went to work immediately, cutting away his uniform to expose the wounds. The shoulder wound had gone straight through the deltoid muscle, painful and debilitating but not immediately life-threatening if she could prevent further infection. But the thigh wound made her stomach drop. The bullet had shattered his femur and she could see bone fragments visible through the damaged tissue. The area around the wound was hot, red and swollen, clear signs of infection. Without proper surgical intervention, Morrison would lose the leg. Without any intervention at all, the infection would spread to his bloodstream, and he'd be dead within 24 hours. She'd gotten here just in time. "This is going to hurt like hell, sir," Vargas warned, then irrigated both wounds with sterile saline solution. Morrison bit down on his own glove to keep from screaming, his body going rigid with pain. Sweat poured down his face despite the cool night air. Vargas worked quickly but carefully, packing both wounds with hemostatic combat gauze impregnated with antibiotics. She gave him a shot of broad-spectrum antibiotics, probably not enough given the severity of the infection, but it was all she had. Next came morphine for the pain. She carefully calculated the dose, enough to take the edge off but not so much that it would suppress his breathing or knock him unconscious. She needed Morrison alert enough to follow instructions when they had to move. She started 2 IVs, one in each arm, and hung bags of fluid mixed with electrolytes from a protruding rock. His body desperately needed hydration. "We need to stay here until tomorrow night," Vargas explained quietly, forcing Morrison to drink water from her canteen. "Too many enemy fighters out there to move during daylight. I counted over 60 Taliban in the valley, and they're actively searching for you. Moving now would be suicide for both of us." She pulled out an energy bar and broke it into small pieces, making Morrison eat despite his protests. His body needed calories to fight the shock and infection. Morrison grabbed her wrist with surprising strength for someone in his condition. His eyes were clearer now, the morphine and fluids already starting to help. "You shouldn't have come," he said, his voice stronger. "You've compromised your position. Now we're both going to die here." There was no accusation in his voice, only resignation and a hint of regret that someone else had been put at risk for his sake. Vargas met his eyes steadily. "With all due respect, Commander, Marines don't leave people behind. My brother taught me that before he died in Fallujah. You're not dying here, and neither am I. We're both getting home." She spoke with absolute conviction, as if she could will it to be true through sheer determination. She pulled out her thermal blanket and covered Morrison with it, both to keep him warm and to mask his heat signature from any thermal optics the Taliban might have. Then she positioned herself at the entrance to their hiding spot, her rifle at the ready, scanning the darkness for threats. In the distance, she could hear voices, Taliban fighters talking, moving around their camps. They were close, too close. She checked her watch, 23:15 hours. Dawn was 8 hours away. 8 hours of sitting in the dark, hoping they wouldn't be discovered, keeping Morrison alive and preparing for whatever came next. Behind her, Morrison drifted in and out of consciousness, the morphine and exhaustion taking their toll. In his fevered dreams, he saw Sarah and Emma, saw his house in California, saw all the things he'd taken for granted and might never see again. But he also saw Elena Vargas, this Marine he barely knew, who had walked alone through enemy territory to save his life. And he made himself a promise. If they got out of this alive, he would spend the rest of his life making sure her sacrifice meant something. In the darkness, Vargas heard footsteps approaching. Her finger moved to her trigger, and she prepared to do what she'd been trained to do: hunt, survive, and protect the man behind her no matter the cost. The night was far from over, and the hardest part was still to come. The footsteps grew louder, crunching over loose gravel and rocks. Elena Vargas could hear at least 4 distinct sets of boots, moving with the casual confidence of men who believed they owned this valley. Through the narrow gap in the rocks that served as her firing position, she could see flashlight beams sweeping back and forth, searching. Her eye was pressed to her rifle scope, her breathing controlled and steady despite her racing heart. Behind her, Morrison was semi-conscious, his labored breathing the only sound in their small sanctuary. The Taliban patrol moved into view, 4 fighters, young men in their 20s wearing a mix of traditional Afghan clothing and tactical gear scavenged from dead coalition soldiers. They carried AK-47s with casual familiarity, and one had an RPG launcher slung across his back. They were talking in Pashto, their voices carrying in the still night air. Vargas's Pashto was limited, but she caught enough words to understand. They were talking about the American they knew had fallen into this ravine, about the reward their commander had promised to whoever found him. 15 meters away, Vargas's rifle was aimed at the lead fighter's center mass. Her finger rested lightly on the trigger, taking up the slack. She'd done the math instantly, 4 targets, maybe 3 seconds to engage them all. The first shot would be the easiest while they were still unaware. The second and third would be reactive shots as they scattered. The fourth would be the challenge, likely running for cover or returning fire. But she could do it. She'd engaged multiple targets faster than this during training. 10 meters. She could see their faces now in the ambient moonlight. The lead fighter had a thick beard and a scar across his left cheek. He was looking at something on the ground, Morrison's blood trail from 2 days ago. The rain hadn't been enough to completely wash it away. He said something to his companions, his voice sharp with excitement. He'd found something. 5 meters. The lead fighter stopped directly in front of the cluster of rocks, so close Vargas could have reached out and touched the barrel of his AK-47. He was studying the ground carefully, following the blood trail with his flashlight. Behind her, Morrison shifted slightly, and Vargas prayed he wouldn't make a sound. The fighter raised his rifle, chambering a round with a distinctive metallic click that echoed off the rocks. This was it, the moment of decision. Vargas centered her red dot sight on the fighter's chest, directly over his heart. One squeeze of the trigger, and 4 men would be dead in less than 4 seconds. She'd killed 17 Taliban fighters during the initial ambush 2 nights ago. 4 more wouldn't weigh on her conscience, but the consequences would be catastrophic. Every Taliban fighter within 5 kilometers would hear the shots. They'd descend on this position like a swarm, and she and Morrison would be trapped with limited ammunition and no escape route. 3 meters. The fighter was reaching toward the rocks now, his hand extending to move aside a piece of brush that partially concealed the entrance. Vargas's world narrowed to the simple geometry of survival, target, sight, trigger. Her finger began the final pressure that would send a bullet through the man's chest. Then his radio suddenly erupted with static and urgent voices. The fighter stopped, pulled back his hand, and grabbed his radio. A harsh voice was barking orders in rapid Pashto. Vargas caught keywords: compound, meeting, commander wants everyone. The fighter responded, clearly frustrated, gesturing at the rocks as if arguing that he'd found something. But the voice on the radio was insistent, brooking no argument. Finally, the fighter spat on the ground in disgust, said something to his companions, and turned away. Vargas watched through her scope as the 4-man patrol moved back down the ravine, their flashlights bobbing in the darkness. She didn't move, didn't even breathe properly for a full 5 minutes after they disappeared. Her finger slowly released the pressure on the trigger, and she became aware that her hands were shaking slightly, adrenaline dump from the near contact. That had been close, closer than anything in her 5 years of combat deployments. It was too close, Morrison whispered behind her, his voice hoarse but coherent. The morphine had worn off enough for him to be aware of what had just happened. Vargas turned to check on him and was alarmed by what she saw in the dim light. His color was worse than before, a grayish pallor that spoke of severe blood loss and systemic infection. His breathing was rapid and shallow, and when she touched his forehead, his skin was burning up. The fever was spiking despite the antibiotics she'd given him. She checked his wounds, changing the dressings with practiced efficiency. The shoulder wound looked relatively stable, but the thigh wound was getting worse. The infection was spreading, red lines of lymphangitis radiating up his leg, a clear sign that bacteria were moving through his lymphatic system toward his bloodstream. If that happened, sepsis would follow, and then multiple organ failure. Without intravenous antibiotics and surgical debridement, Morrison had maybe 24 hours left, maybe less. "How bad is it?" Morrison asked, reading her expression. Even through his fever and pain, the SEAL commander could assess tactical situations, and his own medical condition was a tactical situation. Vargas considered lying, offering false hope, but Morrison deserved the truth. "The infection is spreading faster than I can control it with the antibiotics I have. You need a hospital, surgery, strong IV antibiotics. You need it soon, or—" She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Morrison nodded slowly, understanding. "Then we need to move now, get out of this valley before I can't walk anymore." Vargas shook her head firmly. "Sir, there are over 60 Taliban fighters in this valley. Moving during daylight would be suicide. Even at night, carrying you—" Morrison grabbed her arm, his grip surprisingly strong. "Staff Sergeant, listen to me. I'm a dead man if we stay here. That patrol will be back. Next time they'll search more carefully. We need to move while I can still help, while I can still fight if necessary." Vargas looked out at the valley, calculating distances, routes, enemy positions. Morrison was right about one thing: staying here was becoming untenable, but moving was incredibly dangerous. She pulled out her tactical radio and made a decision she'd been avoiding. She keyed it to the emergency frequency and sent a burst transmission. "Overwatch to base. Package alive but critical. Position compromised. Extraction impossible. Will hold as long as possible." The response came back within seconds, Lieutenant Navarro's voice, tense and worried. "Copy, Overwatch. What's your situation? Can you move to alternate extraction point?" Vargas looked at Morrison, then back at the radio. "Negative. Package is non-ambulatory. Multiple enemy patrols active. Request immediate QRF." There was a long pause, and she could imagine the chaos her request was causing back at FOB Chapman. "Overwatch, stand by," Navarro finally responded. Another pause, longer this time. Vargas imagined him fighting with Colonel Briggs, arguing for an unauthorized rescue mission, putting his career on the line. Behind her, Morrison was trying to sit up, his face contorted with pain and effort. "Elena," he said, using her first name, something he'd never done before. "You need to leave me. Take my sidearm, my grenades, and go. I'll hold them off as long as I can. Give you time to get clear." Vargas turned to look at him, this legendary SEAL commander who was willing to sacrifice himself so she could live. "That's not happening, sir. We're both getting out of here, or neither of us is." The determination in her voice left no room for argument. Morrison tried to protest, but she cut him off. "6 months ago, you came into a hot landing zone to extract me and my spotter. You didn't leave us behind then. I'm not leaving you behind now." The radio crackled to life again. "Overwatch, this is Navarro. We're coming for you. Mark your position and prepare for extraction. ETA 90 minutes. Relief flooded through Vargas, but it was immediately tempered by cold tactical reality. 90 minutes was an eternity when you were surrounded by enemy fighters. And once those helicopters appeared, every Taliban fighter in the valley would converge on this position. "Copy that," Vargas transmitted. "Be advised, LZ is extremely hot. I count 60+ enemy fighters in the valley. You'll be coming into a hornet's nest." She pulled out her infrared strobe, a device visible only through night vision goggles, and set it up on the rocks above their position. That would mark their location for the incoming rescue force, but it would also pinpoint exactly where they were if any Taliban had night vision equipment. She turned back to Morrison and began preparing him for extraction. She gave him another dose of morphine, stronger this time, because the pain of moving was going to be excruciating, and started a third IV bag. She pulled out her remaining ammunition and did a count. 32 rounds left for her M40A5 sniper rifle, 4 magazines for her M4 carbine totaling 120 rounds, and 3 magazines for her sidearm with 15 rounds each, 45 total. Combined, she had 197 rounds. If this became a sustained firefight, she'd run out fast. Morrison was watching her work, his eyes clearer now despite the fever. "How many enemy fighters did you say?" he asked. 60+, Vargas confirmed, checking her rifle's optics. "Spread throughout the valley in groups of 4 to 6. When those helicopters come in, they're all going to converge on us." Morrison pulled out his own Sig Sauer pistol with his good hand, checking the chamber. Despite everything, the wounds, the fever, the infection, the warrior in him was coming back to life. "Then we'd better make every shot count." Vargas moved back to her firing position and scanned the valley through her rifle scope. In the distance, she could see Taliban fighters moving around their campfires, completely unaware that in 90 minutes, 2 American helicopters would be screaming into this valley. She began identifying targets, ranging them, noting their positions. The ones closest to their position would be her first priority. They'd reach the landing zone fastest and posed the immediate threat. Time crawled by with agonizing slowness. Every minute felt like an hour. Vargas kept checking her watch, 60 minutes until extraction, 55, 50. At 45 minutes out, she began to hear a change in the valley. Voices were getting louder, more animated. Flashlights were moving with more purpose. Had they been discovered? Then she saw why. A Taliban commander was moving through the camps, rallying fighters, pointing toward their position. "We've got a problem," Vargas said quietly. "They know we're here." Morrison struggled to a sitting position despite the pain. "How many coming?" Vargas scanned with her scope, counting heat signatures through her thermal optic. "I see at least 20 moving toward us, more behind them." She keyed her radio. "Navarro, be advised, enemy fighters are converging on our position. They know we're here. You need to come now." "We're 30 minutes out," Navarro responded, his voice tight. "Can you hold?" Vargas looked at the approaching Taliban fighters, then at Morrison, barely able to sit up, and at her ammunition count. "We don't have a choice, sir. We'll hold as long as we can." She switched her radio to the team frequency. "When you come in hot and fast. We'll be in a firefight by the time you arrive." She turned to Morrison. "Commander, I need you mobile in 30 minutes. I don't care how much it hurts. I don't care if you have to crawl. When that helicopter comes, you need to be ready to move." Morrison nodded, his jaw set with determination. "I'll be ready, Staff Sergeant. You just keep them off us until then." Vargas gave him a brief smile. "That's the plan, sir." The Taliban fighters were 400 meters away now and closing. Vargas could see them clearly through her night vision, armed men moving with purpose, knowing their prey was cornered. She settled her rifle on its bipod, controlled her breathing, and prepared to do what she did best. The hunter had become the hunted, but Elena Vargas wasn't going down without a fight. Behind her, Morrison checked his pistol one more time, ready to make his last stand if necessary. The valley was about to become a battlefield, and somewhere in the darkness, 2 Black Hawk helicopters were racing toward them, carrying SEAL Team 7 and a promise: no one gets left behind. Vargas put her eye to her scope, acquired her first target at 387 meters, and whispered a prayer her father had taught her before every hunt: steady hand, clear eye, true shot. Then she waited for the enemy to come within range. The longest 30 minutes of her life had just begun. The Taliban fighters moved closer, their flashlight beams cutting through the darkness like searchlights hunting prey. 300 meters, 250. Vargas tracked the lead fighter through her scope, her finger resting lightly on the trigger. Not yet. Every second she waited was another second closer to extraction, another second the rescue helicopters drew nearer. Behind her, Morrison had dragged himself into a better position. His pistol held steady despite the tremor in his hands from fever and pain. At 200 meters, the decision was made for her. One of the Taliban fighters shouted something and pointed directly at their position. Someone had spotted the IR strobe. The group broke into a run, weapons raised. Vargas exhaled slowly and squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked against her shoulder, and 200 meters away, the lead fighter dropped. She worked the bolt smoothly, acquired her second target, fire. A fighter with an RPG went down. Third target, a man raising his AK-47, fire. He crumpled. The valley erupted in chaos. Taliban fighters scattered, diving for cover, trying to identify where the shots were coming from. Vargas kept firing, her movements mechanical and precise. Fourth shot, miss, the target dove behind a rock. Fifth shot, hit, center mass. Sixth shot, hit, headshot on a fighter trying to set up a machine gun. Her rifle was an extension of her will, each shot carefully aimed despite the rapidly developing firefight. Return fire began snapping overhead, bullets ricocheting off the rocks with bright sparks and whining sounds. Morrison fired his pistol at a fighter who'd gotten within 50 meters, the sharp crack of the 9 adding to the chaos. The fighter went down, and Morrison immediately shifted aim to another target. Despite his wounds and fever, muscle memory and training had taken over. 25 minutes, Vargas shouted over the gunfire, keeping Morrison updated on their timeline. She dropped another fighter at 180 meters, then another trying to flank from the east. Her bolt worked like a sewing machine, smooth, fast, reliable. But she was burning through ammunition faster than she'd planned. 15 rounds left in her sniper rifle. She'd have to switch to her M4 soon, which meant less accuracy at distance but faster follow-up shots. The Taliban were getting smarter now, using cover and concealment, advancing by fire and movement. Vargas could see their tactics evolving. They were setting up a base of fire while others maneuvered closer. Professional soldiers would recognize it as standard small-unit tactics. She shifted her aim to the machine gun team setting up 250 meters away, fired twice quickly, and both gunners dropped. That bought them another minute. Behind her, Morrison's breathing had become labored, each breath a struggle. The exertion of fighting was draining what little reserves he had left. "Elena," he gasped, using her first name again, "if they overrun us before the helicopters arrive, you take the strobe and run. Mark a different position. Give yourself a chance." Vargas didn't even look back. "Respectfully, sir, shut up and keep shooting." She switched to her M4 carbine as Taliban fighters pushed within 150 meters. The rifle barked in 3-round bursts, each burst finding a target. A fighter emerging from behind a rock down. 2 fighters trying to rush their position, both down. The M4's rate of fire was keeping the enemy at bay, but her ammunition counter in her head was dropping alarmingly fast. 90 rounds, 75, 60. 15 minutes. She called out. 15 minutes until salvation or death. The Taliban knew it too. Their attacks were becoming more desperate, more aggressive. They could hear the helicopters in the distance now, a faint rhythmic thumping growing gradually louder. The enemy commander was shouting orders, rallying his fighters for a final push before the Americans could extract their prize. A group of 6 fighters made a coordinated assault from 3 directions, and Vargas found herself spinning between targets, firing in controlled panic. Her M4 ran dry, and she dropped the magazine, slammed in a fresh one, charged the weapon, all in less than 3 seconds. Morrison was firing steadily beside her now, his pistol cracking away at targets of opportunity. They were fighting back to back, a Marine and a SEAL, making their stand in a pile of rocks in Afghanistan. The helicopters were visible now, 2 black shapes racing across the night sky, their running lights off, flying dangerously low through the mountain passes. Vargas keyed her radio. "Navarro, we are in heavy contact. LZ is hot. I say again, LZ is extremely hot." The response came back immediately, the sound of rotors nearly drowning out his voice. "Copy, we're coming in. 60 seconds. Those 60 seconds felt like an eternity. Vargas fired her last M4 magazine, dropped it, and drew her sidearm, her final weapon. 15 rounds left. Morrison was down to his last magazine too. They'd held out this long, survived this much, and now it came down to seconds. Could they hold for 1 more minute? A Taliban fighter appeared on top of the rocks above them, silhouetted against the stars, his AK-47 pointed down. Vargas spun and fired twice. The fighter fell backward. Another rushed from the left, and Morrison shot him at point-blank range. They were everywhere now, the position being overrun, and still the helicopters came on. Then the valley exploded with the roar of minigun fire. The lead Black Hawk swept over their position, its door gunners laying down a wall of fire that tore through the Taliban fighters like a scythe through wheat. Tracers lit up the night, and the sound was apocalyptic. 6,000 rounds per minute pouring from each minigun, suppressing everything in a 180-degree arc. The second helicopter came in right behind, and SEALs were fast-dropping down before it even stopped moving. Vargas saw Navarro hit the ground, saw Rodriguez and Jenkins and the others forming a defensive perimeter. "We're here," Navarro shouted, sliding in beside them. "Let's get the commander out." Rodriguez, the team medic, was already working on Morrison, assessing his condition with practiced efficiency. "He's in bad shape," Rodriguez said grimly. "We need to move now." They rigged Morrison to a stretcher while Vargas and the SEALs provided covering fire. The miniguns were still roaring, keeping the Taliban at bay, but RPG fire was starting to come back at them. One rocket streaked past the lead helicopter, missing by meters. "We're taking fire," the pilot called. "Need to extract now." Vargas was nearly out of ammunition, 3 rounds left in her pistol. She fired them at a fighter trying to get an angle on the helicopter, then her slide locked back. Empty. Done. Morrison was being hoisted up to the helicopter now, Rodriguez going with him. Navarro grabbed Vargas's arm. Your turn, move. But Vargas was scanning the battlefield, her tactical mind still working. Then she saw it. A Taliban fighter had gotten into position with a perfect shot at the lead helicopter. He was shouldering an RPG, his finger moving to the trigger. The helicopter was 600 meters away. The fighter was 1,100 meters from Vargas's position, and he was moving. It was an impossible shot. Beyond impossible. But Vargas had made impossible shots before. She grabbed her sniper rifle, dropped to one knee despite her exhaustion, and brought the scope to her eye. No time to range properly. No time to calculate wind drift. Just instinct and experience and a lifetime of shooting. She led the target impossibly far, accounting for his movement, for the bullet's flight time, for factors she didn't even consciously process. She fired. The rifle bucked one last time. 1,000 meters away, through darkness and chaos and impossible odds, the bullet found its mark. The fighter dropped, the RPG falling unfired from his hands. Navarro, who'd seen the shot, stopped dead and stared. "Holy shit," he breathed. "That's impossible." "Marines don't do impossible," Vargas said calmly, slinging her empty rifle. "We just do what's necessary." Then she grabbed the rope and began climbing toward the helicopter, with Navarro right behind her. The rope swung wildly as the Black Hawk banked hard to avoid incoming fire, and Vargas hung on with every ounce of strength she had left. Bullets cracked through the air around her, Taliban tracers creating streaks of green light in the darkness. Below her, the valley floor fell away as the helicopter gained altitude, and she could see muzzle flashes from dozens of positions. The entire Taliban force was converging on them now, realizing their prize was slipping away. Hands grabbed her vest and pulled her into the helicopter's cabin. She collapsed onto the metal floor, gasping for breath, her muscles screaming from 48 hours of constant tension and exertion. Around her, the SEALs were still firing out the doors, their M4s adding to the cacophony of sound. The minigun gunner was traversing his weapon in smooth arcs, hosing down enemy positions with devastating accuracy. "We're not clear yet," the pilot shouted over the intercom, "taking heavy fire from multiple positions. We've got RPGs in the air." The helicopter jerked violently to the left as a rocket streaked past, so close Vargas could feel the heat wash through the open door. The pilot was flying like a madman, jinking and weaving through the valley, using every trick in the book to keep them alive. Vargas crawled over to where Morrison lay on the stretcher, Rodriguez working frantically over him. The commander's face was gray, his breathing shallow and rapid, classic signs of shock. Rodriguez had 2 IV lines running, was squeezing a bag of fluid into Morrison's arm manually, trying to get his blood pressure up. "How is he?" Vargas shouted over the noise. Rodriguez didn't look up from his work. "Alive. Barely. If we don't get him to a surgeon in the next 20 minutes, we're going to lose him." Another RPG streaked toward them, and this time it was too close. The explosion rocked the helicopter, shrapnel pinging off the armored hull. Alarms started blaring in the cockpit. They'd taken a hit. "Engine 2 is damaged," the pilot called out. "We're losing power." The Black Hawk shuddered and began to lose altitude, dropping toward the valley floor in a controlled descent that was rapidly becoming uncontrolled. "Brace for impact," Navarro yelled. The SEALs grabbed whatever they could, forming their bodies as shields around Morrison and the critical equipment. Vargas wedged herself against a bulkhead, her hand instinctively reaching for Morrison's, finding it cold and clammy. The helicopter hit hard, bouncing once, twice, then sliding sideways across rocky ground in a shower of sparks and screaming metal. When they finally stopped, there was a moment of absolute silence. Then Navarro was shouting orders. "Everybody out, secure a perimeter. Jenkins, Rodriguez, get the commander out now. Move, move, move." The SEALs poured out of the crippled helicopter, weapons up, scanning for threats. The second Black Hawk was circling overhead, its miniguns providing covering fire, but it couldn't land. The LZ was too hot, too small, surrounded by enemy fighters. They'd crashed in a dried riverbed, rocks and boulders on all sides providing some cover but also limiting their movement options. Vargas could see Taliban fighters moving on the ridgelines above them, at least 30 that she could count. Jenkins and Thompson were setting up a defensive perimeter, their weapons trained on the high ground. Chen was on the radio, calling for backup, for air support, for anything that could help. "We're pinned down," Navarro said, assessing their situation with brutal honesty. "Can't extract with the second bird, too much fire. Ground convoy would take hours to reach us, and we've got a critically wounded man who doesn't have hours." He looked at Vargas, then at his team, seeing the same determination in every face. They'd come this far. They weren't giving up now. Vargas had retrieved her sniper rifle from the crashed helicopter. Miraculously, it had survived intact. She climbed onto a boulder that gave her elevation and began scanning for targets. Even exhausted, even with her body running on pure adrenaline and willpower, she was still the best shot on this battlefield. She found an enemy machine gun team setting up on a ridge 800 meters away and fired. The gunner dropped. His assistant tried to take over the weapon. She shot him too. "We need to buy time for air support to arrive," Navarro said, moving to her position. "How much ammo do you have left?" Vargas checked her pouches. She'd grabbed extra magazines from the helicopter. "Enough," she said simply. What she didn't say was that enough meant maybe 20 rounds. 20 rounds against 30-plus enemy fighters. The math didn't work in their favor. The Taliban were getting bolder now, seeing the Americans trapped and vulnerable. Groups of fighters were moving down from the ridgelines, using cover and concealment, advancing by bounds. Professional tactics from fighters who'd been at war their entire lives. Vargas picked them off one by one, but for every one she dropped, 2 more appeared. It was like fighting the ocean. You might win individual battles, but the tide always came in. Morrison regained consciousness for a moment, his eyes finding Vargas through his pain and fever. "Elena, the team, get them out." His voice was barely a whisper, each word an effort. Vargas moved to his side, took his hand. "We're all getting out, sir, all of us, that's a promise." Morrison tried to smile but winced instead. "You're a terrible liar, Staff Sergeant." An explosion rocked their position, a mortar round landing 50 meters away. The Taliban had brought up indirect fire. The next one landed closer, 30 meters. They were walking the mortars in, adjusting their fire, and eventually they'd get a direct hit. "Air support! Where the hell is our air support?" Chen was yelling into the radio, his voice desperate. Then they heard it, a sound that every infantry soldier loves, a sound that means salvation is coming. The deep, throaty roar of an A-10 Warthog, the Air Force's premier close air support aircraft. The ugly, beloved plane swept over the valley at low altitude, and its GAU-8 Avenger 30 rotary cannon opened up with a sound like the devil's zipper being pulled. The cannon spat out depleted uranium rounds at 3,900 rounds per minute, and wherever those rounds hit, nothing survived. Taliban positions on the ridgeline simply ceased to exist, torn apart by the withering fire. The A-10 made another pass, this time dropping precision-guided bombs on the mortar position. The explosions lit up the valley like daylight for a brief moment, and when Vargas's vision cleared, the ridgelines were silent. The Taliban were either dead or running. "LZ is clear," the second Black Hawk pilot called. "Coming in now." The helicopter swept in fast, and before it even touched down, SEALs were loading Morrison aboard. Rodriguez never stopped working on him, maintaining the IVs, monitoring his vitals, fighting to keep their commander alive. Vargas provided security, her rifle sweeping the perimeter, ready to engage any threat that appeared. "Last one," Navarro called to her. Vargas backed toward the helicopter, her rifle still shouldered, still scanning. A Taliban fighter appeared on a ridge, raising an RPG. Vargas fired from the hip, an impossible shot that somehow connected, and the fighter fell. Then hands grabbed her and pulled her aboard, and the helicopter was lifting, banking hard, accelerating out of the valley. As they cleared the ridgeline and the valley fell away behind them, Vargas finally allowed herself to believe they might actually survive this. She looked at Morrison, at Rodriguez working over him, at the SEALs around her who'd risked everything to save their commander. This was what it meant to serve. This was what "Leave no one behind" looked like when it stopped being a motto and became reality. "Hospital in 12 minutes, the pilot called back. Vargas looked at Rodriguez, the unspoken question in her eyes. The medic met her gaze and gave the smallest nod. "He'll make it. He's tough. We'll get him there. 12 minutes. After everything they'd been through, Morrison's life came down to 12 more minutes. Vargas closed her eyes, finally allowing exhaustion to wash over her. She'd walked 15 kilometers through enemy territory, held off dozens of Taliban fighters, made impossible shots, and helped rescue a man who'd become more than just a mission. Somewhere far behind them, the sun was beginning to rise over the Afghan mountains, painting the snow-capped peaks in shades of gold and pink. They'd survived the night. Against impossible odds, against overwhelming enemy forces, against logic and reason and tactical doctrine, they'd survived. And now they were going home. The Black Hawk touched down at Bagram Airfield at 6:47 hours, and a full trauma team was waiting on the tarmac. The rotor blades were still spinning when doctors and nurses rushed forward, pulling Morrison's stretcher from the helicopter. Vargas watched them run toward the field hospital, Rodriguez jogging alongside, still squeezing IV fluids, still fighting for every second. The last thing she saw before Morrison disappeared through the hospital doors was his hand, still moving, still fighting, still alive. Lieutenant Navarro stood beside her on the tarmac, both of them swaying with exhaustion. His uniform was torn and blood-stained, his face covered in dust and powder residue. Vargas knew she looked no better. She hadn't slept in 56 hours, hadn't eaten a real meal in 3 days, and her body was running on fumes and willpower. "You did it," Navarro said quietly. "You actually did it. You walked into hell alone and brought him back." Vargas shook her head slowly. "We did it, sir. Your team came when it mattered. That's what made the difference." But Navarro wasn't having it. "Staff Sergeant, I've been a SEAL for 8 years. I've worked with the best operators in the world. What you did, walking 15 clicks through enemy territory solo, keeping Morrison alive for 36 hours, making those shots, that's beyond anything I've ever seen. You're not just good, you're legendary." Colonel Briggs appeared, striding across the tarmac with his command sergeant major. Vargas and Navarro snapped to attention despite their exhaustion. Briggs looked at them both, his expression unreadable. "At ease," he said finally. "Both of you in my office. Now." Vargas felt her stomach drop. This was it, the consequences for launching an unauthorized mission, for disobeying orders, for putting lives at risk. In Briggs's office, the colonel sat behind his desk and studied them in silence for what felt like an eternity. Finally, he spoke. "What you two did was reckless, unauthorized, and violated about 6 different regulations. Lieutenant Navarro, you launched a rescue operation without clearance. Staff Sergeant Vargas, you conducted a solo infiltration mission that should have gotten you killed." He paused, and Vargas braced for the hammer to fall. "It was also," Briggs continued, his stern expression cracking into the smallest smile, "the most courageous thing I've seen in 30 years of service. Morrison is alive because you refused to leave him behind. The Navy is recommending both of you for Valor Awards. And Vargas," he looked directly at her, "the Marine Corps is putting you in for the Navy Cross." Vargas felt her knees go weak. The Navy Cross was the second highest military decoration for valor, behind only the Medal of Honor. "Sir, I was just doing my job," she said quietly. "Any Marine would have." Briggs cut her off with a raised hand. "No, Staff Sergeant, any Marine wouldn't have. Most couldn't have. You did something extraordinary and you're going to accept the recognition with grace. Understood?" "Yes, sir," Vargas said, though the thought of being decorated made her uncomfortable. She hadn't done this for medals or recognition. She'd done it because it was right, because Morrison had once saved her, because leaving people behind wasn't who she was. But she understood that sometimes accepting recognition wasn't about ego, it was about honoring what the medal represented. Morrison's surgery lasted 7 hours. The surgeons removed bone fragments from his shattered femur, repaired blood vessels damaged by the bullet, and debrided the massively infected tissue from both wounds. They pumped him full of broad-spectrum antibiotics and gave him 4 units of blood to replace what he'd lost. When he finally woke up 36 hours later, the first face he saw was his wife Sarah's. She was crying and laughing simultaneously, hitting his good shoulder with gentle punches while tears streamed down her face. "Don't you ever do that to me again, Jake Morrison. Do you hear me? Never again." Morrison, still groggy from anesthesia, managed a weak smile. "Yes, ma'am, I promise." Their daughter Emma was there too, climbing carefully onto the hospital bed, wrapping her small arms around her father's neck. "Daddy, you're home. The Marine lady brought you home." 3 months later, the California sun was brilliant over Camp Pendleton, and a crowd of Marines and SEALs filled the parade ground for the awards ceremony. Elena Vargas stood at attention in her dress blues, deeply uncomfortable with all the eyes focused on her. She tried to decline the ceremony, twice, but the Marine Corps had insisted. Her parents had flown in from Colorado, and she could see her mother crying in the front row, holding a photo of Marcus in his Marine uniform. The citation was read aloud, describing her actions in clinical military language that somehow failed to capture the reality of walking alone through enemy territory, of holding off dozens of fighters with limited ammunition, of keeping Morrison alive against impossible odds, for extraordinary heroism and inspiring valor in the face of the enemy. Staff Sergeant Elena Vargas conducted a solo rescue mission deep behind enemy lines, sustained the life of Commander Morrison for 36 hours under constant enemy contact, eliminated 17 enemy combatants, and enabled the successful extraction of SEAL Team 7. Her actions were in keeping with the highest traditions of the Marine Corps and the United States Naval Service. Then Commander Jake Morrison walked across the parade ground to pin the Navy Cross on her uniform. He was in his service dress blues, walking with only a slight limp, a miracle considering the doctors had initially said he'd never walk properly again. Morrison had proven them wrong through sheer determination and months of brutal physical therapy. He'd refused to accept anything less than full recovery. Morrison took the Navy Cross from its velvet case, and Vargas could see his hands were steady and sure. He pinned it on her uniform, then stepped back and saluted. Vargas returned the salute crisply, and the crowd erupted in applause. But Morrison wasn't done. He turned to address the assembled Marines and SEALs, his voice carrying across the parade ground. "I've served in combat for 17 years, Morrison began. "I've worked with Army Rangers, Air Force PJs, Marine Force Recon, and the best SEALs the Navy has ever produced. I thought I knew what courage looked like. I thought I understood what it meant to be a warrior." He paused, looking directly at Vargas. "But what Staff Sergeant Vargas did goes beyond courage, beyond heroism, beyond anything I've ever witnessed." He gestured to the SEALs of Team 7, standing in formation. She walked 15 kilometers through enemy territory, alone, to save a man she barely knew. She held off dozens of enemy fighters for 36 hours with limited ammunition and supplies. She made shots that were literally impossible, shots that saved not just my life, but the lives of my entire team. His voice grew stronger. "She carried me out of hell on her back, and she did it without hesitation, without complaint, without asking for anything in return." Morrison held up a unit patch. It showed a female sniper with angel wings and the words "Protected by Saint Elena" embroidered below. These men have adopted a new motto. They wear this patch on their uniforms as a reminder that heroes come in all forms, and that the most legendary warriors don't always carry tridents. The crowd laughed, and Vargas felt herself blushing furiously. "Staff Sergeant Vargas will tell you she was just doing her job," Morrison continued. "That any Marine would have done the same thing, but we all know the truth. What she did, no one else could have done. She is the finest warrior I've ever had the honor to serve with, and I owe her my life." After the ceremony, Vargas found herself surrounded by young Marines asking questions, seeking advice, wanting to know how to become scout snipers. She answered patiently, but her mind was elsewhere. She was thinking about Marcus, her brother, the Marine who taught her to shoot and shown her what service meant. He died trying to save his squad in Fallujah. She'd always wondered if she could be as brave as him when her moment came. Now she knew she had been. As the crowd dispersed, Morrison found Vargas sitting alone near the parade ground, looking out at the Pacific Ocean. He sat down beside her without speaking. They'd both seen too much, done too much to need words. The ocean rolled in steady, eternal waves. Finally, Morrison broke the silence. "What are you going to do now, Staff Sergeant?" Vargas was quiet for a long moment. "I don't know, sir, after everything," she trailed off. Morrison nodded, understanding without explanation. "Combat changed you. Some things you could never unsee." "My daughter Emma wants to meet you properly," Morrison said, shifting topics. "She drew you a picture, a woman in a cape with a big rifle saving people. She wants to be like you when she grows up." Vargas smiled genuinely for the first time in weeks. "I'd like that, sir, to meet her properly." Morrison stood to leave, then turned back. "Elena, and I'm using your first name because we're off duty and because you saved my life. Thank you. Thank you for giving me a chance to watch my daughter grow up, to grow old with Sarah, to have a life. That's the greatest gift anyone has ever given me." Vargas looked up at this legendary SEAL commander who had survived the impossible. "You would have done the same for me, sir. That's what makes us who we are." Morrison smiled. "Maybe, but you actually did it, and that makes all the difference." Years later, when people asked Staff Sergeant Elena Vargas about that night in Afghanistan, she always gave the same answer. "I did what any Marine would do. We don't quit, and we don't leave our people behind." But everyone who'd been there knew the truth. What she did wasn't what any Marine would do. It was what the best Marine, at her absolute finest, could do. The legend spread. The female sniper who'd walked alone into enemy territory and brought back a SEAL commander. Young women enlisted because of her. Scout sniper schools evolved their training. SEAL Team 7 never forgot. To this day, they wear the patch with the angel-winged sniper, a reminder that heroes are real, that courage knows no gender, and that the greatest warriors are measured not by how many enemies they kill, but by how many friends they save. Elena Vargas went on to train the next generation, passing on not just shooting skills but values, duty, honor, and the absolute refusal to leave anyone behind. And somewhere in California, a girl named Emma Morrison grew up knowing that a Marine named Elena had given her father back to her, that heroes walked among us, that one person in the right moment with enough courage could change everything. The sun set over Camp Pendleton, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. Vargas stood and walked back toward the barracks, the Navy cross heavy on her chest but her heart light. She'd done her duty. She'd honored her brother's memory. She'd proven that Marines kept their promises. And she'd brought Jake Morrison home,